Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be on whiteness. For those who didn't notice, I'm actually white, so I'm going to be a little bit biased because I'm white. But I'm going to basically show you an article that was written in Psychology Today, which is a fairly famous publication, and it's on whiteness, and it's from this year. So this is the current sort of current way of thinking about whiteness, and I kind of wanted to go through it and kind of give you my sort of 2 cents on what I think whiteness is and how whiteness is a thing or not a thing. And I just kind of want to go through the article. So one of the things that I want to say is first my opinion about what I think of as whiteness. I'm not a race denialist. Like I do believe that there are races, and within races there's ethnicities. So I believe that there is difference between Europeans and Africans. And Europeans, though they are very varied, uh, they have some commonalities, and they have cultural connections. And the same applies to Africans. Like they're very varied. There's a huge variety between Africans, and you can't say that they're all the same, but there are similarities between the different African groups. Okay, and those similarities as a group make them a group. Okay, so and those similarities are not just physical. It's not just like, oh, they all have black skin or they all have white skin. It is that they have fundamental similarities, not with their culture, with their way of living, their viewpoint, their personalities. There's similarities within that in the way that they think. There's also biological similarities. So we can't say that it's just like some made social construct kind of thing. There is sort of evidence to suggest that these races are real, and there's the main races, which is white, Asian, yellow, if you want to go that way, black, and red, which is the native population of North America. So we got those racial groups. And there's also brown, which is Indian and sort of Middle Eastern. So those are the kind of main racial groups. And we got to recognize those as real. If we can't recognize those as real, then we have real problems. Because, a lot of the time there's the issue where the left will have you believe two things that are completely contradictory in the same thought. So one thing they'll say is the concept of race is like invaded by white people, and therefore it's invalid. And then they'll say that we're all just one human race. But at the same time, they'll say, well, there's people of color, and then there's white people. And they'll sort of anyways divide the people of the planet into different groups. So you can't have both. I'm a little bit more consistent in the way I think, and I believe that racial groups do exist. Now, one of the things that is a common myth within this whole racial thing is that people before the 1800s believed that we were all one race, and that is actually not true. They didn't really define the racial groups the way we define them now, but they did understand that there were racial groups. they understood, like, if you went to China as a black or white person, they would say that you are a foreigner, and they would sort of be able to say you are of a different race. And the same would happen in Africa. Like even the Egyptians, they would identify the Nubians as like a different racial group. And it's within our history that we've always sort of identified the different groups. Most ethnicities, most cultural groups do have an in-group preference, and they'll generally protect that in-group preference. They'll be more like closed societies, especially going back historically. It's only recently that we've become more of an open society where we really don't understand our own cultural connectivity and the importance of that. So in the past, people would really defend their borders because they wanted to have that cultural connection, and it was very important. And people would really like. If you look at Europe, Europe is a really great example of this, where it's very tribal in terms of the way it's laid out, where each nation is really just people of similar ethnicity, and you see countries that failed within Europe as being ones that where that cultural identity was really divided amongst multiple groups. And you see the same happening elsewhere in the world, where cultural groups kind of will form a tight-knit unit. One of the problems that happened with colonialism in Africa was that the Europeans sort of divided the territory based on where they had sort of conquered, rather than looking at the people within those areas and saying, oh, okay, well, these people are all pretty much the same. This should be a nation, and so forth. So what you're having now is kind of those nations sort of sorting themselves out, and the different tribal groups kind of dividing and creating new nations. So this is kind of one of the negative legacies of colonialism in Africa. There's probably others that we can talk about, but that's for a different video. But let's get back to whiteness. And for me, as I said, first we have to recognize that races exist, and whiteness, just like any, is just the white group. So I would say, yes, whiteness exists. There's cultural similarities between people of Europe, even though there's lots of differences within those cultural, like I don't really identify with Italian people. I don't identify with Scandinavian people. I identify very much with British people. However, I have a lot of cultural similarities between myself and Italian and Norwegian, for example. So, and more so than I would with some African or Chinese, culture, because, it's just, or Asian, I should say, because there is similarities. Proximity does matter, and there are things going on there. So Europeans are kind of similar in many ways. Asians are similar in many ways. So that has to be understood. I kind of want to reinforce this because it's really important to understand that I recognize that there's cultural differences within the different races, but at the same time, I recognize that races exist. So that's really important to understand. Okay, so with that said, what are those cultural things about Europe? What would classify people as having that cultural experience of Europe? And because Europeans sort of conquered North America, well, we'll see those similarities within the cultures of Canada and the United States. So for me, some of those things are a little bit of blandness. I would say, one of the concepts that I really do think that white people are in some ways a bit bland. And I don't mean that as an insult to white people, but it is true. We have a tendency of being a bit uptight, very punctual. We eat blander foods, maybe because of the northern climates. Generally, we'll eat more bland food. And there's a bunch of sort of stereotypical white things. We follow the rules. We like to create rules. We like to be self-reliant. We're very independent. These are all kind of traits that I would associate with whitey people. I only used the term whitey after I met my wife. Actually, she's Asian, and she basically encouraged, she would always refer to white people as whitey. So after a while, I got used to the term, and so those things, those characteristics, I would associate with whitey people. So that's an homage to my wife. so, um, but those are things that other groups also can have. Like, it's just, but I see them more as intrinsically a white related. Or when people think of the stereotypes of white people, they generally kind of think of them in those ways: a bit uptight, bit accurate in the way that they do things. Individualistic. These are the kind of things that we associate with white culture. A little bit bland. They always joke about white people are not able to eat spices, and I actually, it's somewhat true. There is a biological thing going on there. So it's true. We generally have, if you look at European foods that are natural to Europe, well, they're kind of bland. And there's a thing there. Also, we like a lot of cheese and milk. These are, cultural things, but also there's biological reasons for it, where we grew up with those staple foods. Um, Whereas a lot of Asians and Africans don't have that culture. So they can't actually digest some of the foods that we would digest in Europe. So there's differences. And we can't similarly digest some of the foods that they eat. So, it's based on what you had in the areas you live. And those differences actually create not just differences in the types of food we eat, but differences in the personalities. It's funny how much food influences the way we think and feel and stuff. And another thing that we have to understand is the importance of language. European languages have only a few roots. Like you have the Romantic languages, and then you have the Germanic languages. And the way that you think is very influenced by your language. So I always think about French versus English, and I speak both. Not necessarily well in either. I was joking. No, but my French is so-so. So one of the things that I think about in French is how the structure is very different. So in English, you have subject, and then verb, and then object, right? That standard format. Whereas in French, the verb is at the end. Yeah, like it's a different order. Is the point that I'm trying to get. That order in a way kind of impacts the way that you think. And where the emphasis within the thought pattern is a little bit different. And it's just these kind of things, like, they seem small, but they can have big influence. So language being kind of fairly common between the European countries, like they, because they're always fighting with each other, and they basically, that language got kind of spread. And even though there's distinct languages, there is similarities. Like, so even though I don't speak Italian, or I don't speak Spanish, or don't speak German, I can actually understand elements of those because there's some commonality. And that's maybe the best way to even understand this whole argument, that really what we're doing is we're looking at those commonalities. So, wow, a lot of a lot of preamble to just get into this article that I really want to show you. So now I might as well show you the article. I just want to at least give you my sense of what whiteness is. So let me just go into the article here. So I'm going to make myself, yeah, okay, that should be good. So here's the article. What is whiteness? What is whiteness? my influence from my wife. What is whiteness? Should people be proud of a group marked by power and privilege? So one of the things that this writer does right at the beginning is make that association. that about this kind of inherent privilege, and I really think that that's kind of poisoning the well. A lot of the time, what we have in North America and Europe is not necessarily white privilege, but it's European privilege. I would actually say that there is an advantage to being uh, of the same culture as the country you're in. So if I go to Japan, well, as a white person, I'm going to be at a disadvantage just because the culture and the way the systems of law, all of that is designed for Japanese people. It's designed based on what works best for them. And it's different than the way the systems are in Europe and North America. Whereas if you go to Africa, it's the same thing. Like, there will be a local advantage because the systems of that country or place are really designed for those people of that country or place. It just makes sense. The countries are really created for the people who live in those countries. So if you're a minority or somebody coming into a country that is not of that culture, well, of course, you're going to feel some disadvantage to being different. It's just life. And I don't see that as necessarily like a privilege. Like I hate the way the word privilege has been demonized, but I do see it as an advantage, of course. And yes, you have certain advantages. However, one of the great things about European societies and society that exists in both in North America, is that our societies are really designed to benefit everyone. We have a lot of egalitarian beliefs, and I'm not necessarily a big fan of egalitarian beliefs, but we have a lot of that in our culture, where we try to make the laws and such really reflect an egalitarian kind of mindset where everybody's treated equally, everyone's treated fairly, and all this kind of things. Whether or not that is truly true is questionable, but the thing is, we do have that as a precedent that we try to incorporate within our countries. Whereas in other countries, that's not the case at all. Like if you look at India, for example, India has the caste system, and you can basically, you can be born of a certain caste and you're stuck in that caste forever. There's actually biological differences between the castes because of the fact that they've been so insulated because of the whole structure that exists. Whereas in European societies, there's a lot of mobility between the different classes. And there is exceptions to that, but my point is there's a lot more egalitarian and opportunities available within a European kind of designed society. So I don't like this whole concept of privilege because it's kind of, it would almost be more accurate to say of other groups than white groups, if that makes sense. But so the way the article starts is actually quite nice, I would have to say. It basically says, is it okay to be proud of being white? Okay. And they say that's a good question. And, because you're born white and you can't do anything about it. And that's how they start. So they almost make it sound like they're going to be reasonable, but then they quickly quickly leave that and they become unreasonable. One of the things that they go into is this concept of whiteness, okay? And they say it's imported from Spain and Portugal during the slavery era, where whiteness was defined as a way to contrast one's identity as different from the slaves. Now, this is totally not true. It's just totally baseless to say that. So what they're trying to say, that the concept of race and the concept of whiteness in itself is that if you're white, you see everybody else as a slave, basically, because you're different from them, and them are the slaves. And that is just a horrible way to frame it. The concept of, as I said, the concept of race really existed long before this whole slave situation. Like, I mean, slavery's been around as well for a long time, but it's not that they define people based on, he's a slave, therefore he's a different race. It was never that case. It was more that we saw there was differences between the groups, and we would define those groups based on those differences. That the concept of race really wasn't about slavery. It just wasn't about that. It was more of a way of classification. One of the things that you have to understand is a little bit of history, and this writer obviously doesn't have a sense of history. If you go back in time to Aristotle, one of the things that Aristotle did was he really got into the concept of classification. And he was the one that created this whole idea of like classifying the different animals into race, genus, like all the different phylum and all those kind of separate groups, so you could sort of create like a classification of animals and kind of organize all the animals into different groups. And there's a lot of reasons why you want to do that. Later on, when the Age of Enlightenment and like people sort of revisited a lot of those early Greek ideas, they basically said, hey, let's go further with it. Let's start classifying individual humans. And then they sort of started breaking out the different groups of humans and sort of really trying to understand those. Also with the concept of evolution, there was a bit of that as well, where they were saying, okay, let's look at how we can classify man and see the different early men and classify those, and like, let's look at modern man, let's classify those. And they really try to understand each of the groups and try to classify them so that they could be organized, basically. It wasn't necessarily about slavery at all. no connection to slavery. So this is just not a good way to start. It's a very dishonest way to start. And I have a tendency of seeing this with, I see this with a lot with the people on the left. They will, like, you can take any topic and they'll somehow reconnect it to slavery, as if everything in the world is based on slavery. And it's just a very negative way to look at the world. And it's just not a very realistic way of looking at the world, because there's a lot more than slavery that went on in the years that happened before us. So yeah, slavery is a thing, but it's not the only thing. Okay, so the concept of race continues to define people in this way, socially, though not legally anymore. Okay, so she recognizes at least that there has been some social changes, albeit with stubborn, desperate outcomes. Okay, well, so I don't even know what to say about that. But culture and ethnicity are good. Okay, so she recognizes that culture and ethnicity are good, but then she's going to demonize it. Don't worry. In the course of studying race and culture, I've come to understand that race is a destructive thing. Okay, I'm not sure why she sees it this way, but we'll see. As it categorizes people into castes based on their appearance and presumed ancestry. Now, this is one of those common mistakes, and this is why I had such a big preamble at the beginning of this video, where I was really trying to explain my viewpoints on this whole topic. That one of the mistakes that people make is they always say, oh, race is just deep. Oh, they're black, or they're white, or they're whatever. No, that's not how race works. It's beyond skin deep. There's actual bone structures. There's mental differences. There's a lot of differences between the racial groups. And this is just, it's one of those tropes that I hate, where I see, oh, it's just skin deep. Oh, you're biased because you see him and he has a different skin color than you. Well, it's more than that. Okay. They're way more than that. So ethnicity, so then they go into ethnicity and culture are good things, as they are built by a group for the well-being of that group, but not race, which is defined as a dominant culture and imposed upon non-dominant group. So this is like whenever you see this dominance or power kind of keywords being used within any kind of article, you can sense that these people are probably cultural Marxists or people who've been radicalized in some way. One of the things, like a lot of the postmodernists will talk about things where it's structures of power, structures of like institutionalized things, where a lot of the cultural things that they try to say, or a lot of the discriminatory things, are based on systems of power. And that's a very postmodernist and I would say cultural Marxist way of thinking of things, that they really love that concept of power and the different groups fighting with each other. I just really want you to see that you got to always kind of be cognizant of the language used by these people, because it does influence the way that they think and the way that they're really creating a narrative. So one of the things is they like to get into this racialized, marginalized, stigmatized. So basically they see the concept of race as being something that is a system where white people are dominating other groups, and back to that slavery thing, like it's us versus them, and that we use our whiteness as a way to dominate over other groups. So it's a power thing. And that is it's just not based on reality. It's just one of these things where, as I said, they love to assume that things are done as a pure power thing. Whereas really what she said about ethnicity is more accurate about race. So ethnicity and culture are good things as they are built by a group for the well-being of that group. Well, yeah, that's actually how race works. We generally, like European societies, well, are European societies, and they're built for the well-being of that group. African societies are African societies, and they're built for the well-being of that group. So I actually like that sentence, but then she flips it and tries to make it these systems of power. She was it's like almost like she kind of clues in that this is the way things are, but then she loses sight when she gets kind of her like postmodernist panties in a bunch or something. I don't know. It's kind of weird. So what is whiteness? Whiteness, according to her, is an unfairly privileged exclusionary category based on physical features, most notably the lack of melanin. Now, why did she say the most notably lack of melanin? Well, that's a way of saying that these groups, this racial groups, this racial identity is purely white people imposing this upon everyone else. White people are the ones that lack melanin, and white people are the ones that are unfairly privileged and excessively exclusionary, and they're exclusionary in the way that they behave. And I actually would say that that is blatantly untrue. If you look at what societies are the most inviting to other cultures, it is European ones. It is North American ones. We have the United States, which up till recently had been majority white, majority meaning like 90% white, has basically opened their doors to other races and other groups, and now is like maybe 60% white. So within a 30-year span. Now, no other group has really done that. It's insanity in some ways, because it will destroy their society. If all of a sudden some African nation had a mass influx of white people, they would be up in arms about it. They would never allow that. For example, if you try to immigrate into China, for example, they will never let you immigrate into China. You'll never be a Chinese person if you're non-Chinese ethnicity. The same goes for Japan, Korea, most of the Asian countries are like that, where they really won't let you immigrate into those countries. They'll let you semi-immigrate where you can maybe kind of live there, but you'll never be truly part of that culture. Okay, they'll never let you fully integrate within that society, and it is what it is. And the same goes to Africa. You'll always be a foreigner. So this is just not true. It's actually the opposite. Whereas it's really white cultures that are generally very inclusionary, and the other cultures are generally the opposite. If you look at, there's like graphs where you can see, or graphs, I should say maps of the world where they show the most racist countries versus the least racist countries. And when I think of the concept of racism, I actually think of it a little bit differently than most people. I think of the concept of racism as being a thing, it's a bit of a made up thing. Generally everyone is racist, generally, because we'll have in-group preferences. We'll generally think we're from a better way of living because it's what is comfortable to us. So that is by definition racist, but that I don't see that as a negative thing. Generally what you'll find is the ones, like the countries which are the least discriminatory in terms of having that in-group preference are going to be the European and North American ones. And the ones that are going to be the most discriminatory and most have the strongest in-group preferences are going to be the countries like India and African nations. So yeah, it's it's a very false assertion to make this claim. Okay, so let's get into they talk about it's okay to have pride in your German, French, blah blah, culture, but one should not be proud of being white, because it's just they see it as a forced membership, and I actually think that that's a false conclusion, but we'll just go with it. White Americans are imbued with whiteness from infancy. They do not choose it for themselves. People who look white and who have immigrated into America generally are afforded whiteness upon arrival, whether they want it or not. So again, she almost has this like concept of like this weird whiteness thing that's just sort of floating around. Well, a better way to go is what she said earlier, is to say that the societies are built to promote the benefit of the people who created the societies. And generally, people who have commonalities, as I said, Europeans have common cultures. And generally what you'll find is if you have like some kind of commonality between the cultures, even though the different ethnicities within Europe are very different, at least they have some commonalities. Well, those commonalities will allow you to adapt much easier and it'll be much easier to accept somebody who has those commonalities than somebody that doesn't share those commonalities. So generally that will happen. Like, for example, like when I was living in Korea, we actually, I was teaching in Korean, like Korean English school, and one guy also was Canadian, but he was Korean Canadian. So he was born and raised in Canada. But when he came to Korea, he was immediately accepted because he had a Korean look, first of all, but also because of his parents, he had that cultural connection. And he was sort of accepted very, very quickly because of that. There was actually some weirdness, though, where they kind of discriminated against him in a weird way in Korea because his Korean was not up to snuff. And they thought, oh, what's wrong with him? He's like got some problem. And so in a way, they kept on speaking to him in Korean, and he would be like, my Korean's not the greatest. And he would he would have that kind of weird issue. But the point is, he was it was much easier for him to adapt to Korea. And in some ways, he was actually more comfortable in Korea because he had that cultural similarity to the Korean people than even when he was living in Canada. So there is that where the societies are designed for the people who live in those societies. It's just the way it is. And that's not racism. That's not discrimination. It's just reality. Um, so we generally accept people that look like us. It's just the way it is, and because we know that they have that commonality of culture, and it's just easier to deal with somebody when you know how you can deal with them. Like, when you get into the situation where there's real differences in the culture, it can be really awkward to communicate with that person because you're speaking in a way that they're not used to, and it can be really difficult sometimes. I've seen cultural differences cause real problems when people are trying to communicate with each other, and it's kind of interesting to see. Um, okay. So now she gets into the concept of white guilt. Many white people are reluctant to define or even discuss whiteness due to unpleasant feelings that it can guilt, invoke of guilt and shame. Now, I actually don't think this is false in a way, but it's misunderstanding what really is happening. So what happens is whiteness, and just the way she has defined it, is this negative thing. And we are smart creatures. We learn quickly that if you keep on defining whiteness as this privileged, unearned thing that's somewhat evil and oppressive, well, generally most people will not want to associate with that kind of negative thing. And if you basically say, okay, well, you have it, even though really you didn't really associate to it, because it's as I said, it's a bogus term. Like, they're basically creating this thing where they're demonizing you for being white, and it's something that you can't control. and then of course, and then they're shaming you for having it. It's like one of those kind of situations where yes, you'll have white guilt because you don't want to be associated to something like to something that's negative. It's just sort of like a lot of the Germans have this real problem where they are ashamed of their history because way back when you had a movement within Germany that killed a lot of people, the Nazi movement, and they feel real shame about that. And it's something that can be weaponized against the Germans, where they will feel real guilt, and you can use it against them to basically shame them into anything you want them to do. Um, and that's what whiteness is. It's a tool that's being used where you define it as something negative. You define it as this slavery kind of term. You define it as something where it is a power control thing, unearned privileged. It's all these negative traits that actually are very culturally against what white people believe. I told you one of the things that defines white people is this concept of egalitarianism, where white people want to actually, create societies where people are treated fairly. And so when you create this concept of whiteness as being something that's opposite of that, well, of course, that goes against their cultural experience. Well, they're going to be like, well, I don't identify as that. I don't, like, that doesn't, like, that seems very contradictory to the way I was raised and the way I believe and all this kind of stuff. Well, what it'll do is it'll create that negative association. And so you, as a white person, you will reject the concept of whiteness because it is so opposed to the way you were raised and the culture that you are born with. So this concept of whiteness is a real tool rather than actually something that is beneficial, like as a term It's just a weapon that's being used against white people. So that's really important to understand, that the reason people have unpleasant feelings is that because the term is just so incorrect. It's just so biased term that really doesn't define whiteness at all. It's something that's used to say whiteness, and this is what whiteness is, but it doesn't actually define it. It's sort of like if you said, okay, well, what is blackness? And you defined it as something like, well, laziness, um, uh, really somebody who's just evil, uh, somebody who is just criminal, and somebody who is oppressive to others. And you define it with all these negative things. Well, no black person would want to be associated with that. They'd be like, I don't want to be associated to that term, because that's all these negative traits that I don't think I have, and I don't think anyone has. And they would just say, well, I'm going to reject that. And but what has happened is it's only with whiteness that we have this. There is no blackness, there is no Asianness. It's only a term that's being weaponized against white people. And that's really important to understand. So this is why they get in. The next thing she goes into is, when people, the shame is particularly toxic. And she actually recognizes the fact that when you create this kind of term that shames people, it is toxic. It is a toxic emotion due to the lengths at which people will go to avoid this feeling, which is typically includes blame shifting, aggression, and other forms of hostility. So basically, she's saying, well, we are going to shame you, and and then if you have these feelings of like where you want to shift it to somebody else and say, well, that's not me, and I'm blaming this keyword, whatever this word is, and people get upset about it, people will be hostile about it, because if you accuse somebody of doing something that they didn't do, well, generally they will get aggressive, they will be hostile. So so basically, she, instead of seeing the way people react to it as just typical reaction of blaming somebody for something that they didn't do, and the natural reactions to doing that to any group, any person will have this kind of result where they will be hostile. Instead of seeing it that way, she says, well, if you act hostile, if you act aggressive, that's only confirmation that you are this thing that we're accusing you of. So it's like, wow, you're so screwed in this case. And this might lead to self-harm or to atone for wrongs done. And this is actually one of the things that they use this concept of whiteness to do, is to cause harm to white people, where these white people feel like they must atone for the wrongs done. You'll see this a lot on the left, where they feel like they have to atone for wrongs that they haven't done, that white people in general haven't done, but somehow because of this concept of whiteness, they feel like they must atone for. And generally, you could do this with any group, and you'll find the same kind of result, where people, they will want to prove themselves better than this term that you've labeled them as, and they will do whatever it takes to sort of say, hey, look, I'm not that. I'm a good guy. I'm one of the good guys. I'm not like this other group that you've classified me as. I'm better than that. Especially white people will always feel that it's necessary to prove themselves. It's kind of a weird thing, but it's part of the culture as well. So generally, you'll see really crazy things happening on the left, where you get these people that have been shamed and crushed through these kind of keywords of white guilt and whiteness, and they've been crushed so hard by it that they will kiss the feet of black people. They will wear yokes around their necks in order to atone for slavery that they never committed. So this is a real form of oppression against white people. So it is difficult to get a man to understand something which, when his salary depends upon it, upon his not understanding it. So again, one of the concepts that they love to push is not only are white people privileged in their societies that they built for themselves, but the only reason that they have any success is that they are supporting this system of whiteness. And that's, again, it's just like shaming you for, so if you succeed, you're being shamed for succeeding. And it's just very, very sad. But then she tries to address another main talking point of people on the right. So one of the things that people on the right will say is, okay, white, Asian power, black power, those are good things. Why is it when people say white power or white pride that it's negative? And they say, oh, that's racist. If you say white power, that's racist, or white pride, that's racist. And so she tries to explain why that is true. So the concept, again, is postmodernist. And one of the things that they look at is they look at who has the power. So in the the postmodernist way of thinking, white people have power, and therefore it's sort of like back to racism. Well, only white people can be racist because they're the ones with the power, and therefore they are the ones that can control, the racism. They're basically the ones that are the beneficiaries of everything, and therefore they are the ones that can only be the oppressors. Okay, and the same thing goes for the way that they see pride. Well, for those people who have been demonized by these evil white people, well, they're being demonized for being black or being Asian or whatever. Well, those people, when they say that they take pride in their culture, well, they are actively fighting against that evil, oppressive narrative of the white people. Okay? And they are the ones who are rising up and saying, "Hey, I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of what I have accomplished, and I'm proud of being black." Okay, and that's a good thing to say. But for a white person, that's not a good thing to say. However, in a weird way, what she has created is an argument for actually white people to say, "Yes, I'm proud of being white," because with this concept of whiteness, it is an oppressive term. It is actually marginalizing white people because it's basically saying you're evil, and if you're white, you're born evil, and that's marginalizing people. So if people actually say, "I'm proud of being white," then that should be a good thing based on our own logic, because they're basically going against the narrative, and they're going against that oppression that they're facing within society. And they're saying that I appreciate who I am for who I am, and I'm going to deny your marginalization. So in a way, that's kind of where this whole concept of black pride goes, but it also allows for the concept of white pride to exist. Because if we're being marginalized for being white, well, then we should be allowed to be proud of being white based on her own logic. So they love another word that you can see within a lot of sort of postmodernist way of thinking is this concept of constructs. So they say that race is a construct. It's a meaningless thing to say because yes, it is a construct. Any word is a construct. It doesn't mean that it's less real that we constructed that word. It just means that it's a term that has been used to define something that is observable in reality. So yes, it's a construct, but it's a construct that has a purpose. So I always hate these things when they talk about constructs and stuff like that. That's another red flag in terms of knowing where the bias lies in the writer. Okay, so this constructs term. And so let me just quickly get to the end of this article. And basically, she goes on about saying whiteness is a third rail. People of color have had too much work in describing and defining the concept of whiteness. Since white-dominated societies created this system and continue to use it, it is important that all members of our society share in the responsibility in understanding and fixing it. So basically, that's the crux of all of this. This whole essay is really to say, okay, we got this problem called whiteness. Whiteness is about white people dominating other people. It is a concept built on slavery. They love having it built on slavery. And it is a concept of racism, where white people are racist against everybody. And we, as good people of color, generally is the way that they think, or good white people, maybe, they might allow us, because they say becoming a true white ally. Okay, they try to get that in there. That, oh, white people, you can atone for yourself here. Well, as we gotta dismantle, they love this concept of dismantling structures. And what does that mean? Well, that means that anything associated with white people must be destroyed, taken apart, and rebuilt to support the other groups. Well, what does that actually mean? Let's think about what that actually means. Well, our societies in Europe and North America were designed for our ethnicities, designed for white people in general, because they are white societies. And they will have concepts within those white societies that perpetuate the cultural beliefs of those societies. As I said, egalitarianism, hard work, individualism, okay? And those are good things. I think those are very good things. But what they want to do is they want to dismantle it so that they can put in something that they see as advantageous to their ultimate goal. And the ultimate goal, a lot of this stuff, is really to push in socialist ideas. It never says it directly, but generally what they'll often say is one of the things of whiteness is capitalism. And they don't, this article does not have that, at least fortunately. But one of the things that often gets mixed in is the concept of capitalism. Now, capitalism is something that works in all nations. It's not just only working well in white nations. It works well everywhere. And any culture or society that brings in capitalism generally will be better for it. However, a lot of these people who think about the concept of whiteness in the way that they think it generally are socialists and generally hate capitalism. And one of the things that they're really trying to root out, one of the things that they really want to dismantle is the concept of capitalism. And really that's where this is all leading to, where they want to dismantle the system so that they can install their system, which is a socialist system or a system that will benefit their groups. Generally, their goal is not to actually help white people at all. It's very clear that their goal is to actually harm white people and make it so that the societies are more geared towards the needs of the minorities. And that's actually an impossible thing, because one thing that has happened with all this, push for culture, like bringing in lots of different groups from all over the world, is it's not just white people versus everyone else, as this article would imply. There are very big differences between African groups and Asian groups. There's big differences between the different Asian groups and the different African groups within each other. So if you try to organize your society around all of that, it's impossible, because there's going to be so many contradictions that it will not work. A better way is to just accept that actually the systems that were built by Europeans are actually quite good. If you look at the societies built by Europeans, they're very successful. And it's because they have these basic cultural beliefs in individualism, in fairness, in equality, in uh, individualism, capitalism, things that really foster growth of that society. And I'm not saying that these things are only associated to Europeans, but they are really fundamental to European cultures. And if we try to like dismantle that, I think that would be a very bad thing to do. So let me just scroll down and you can see her references. They're all actually, if you look at the references, it's like White Fragility. That's a horrible book. It's like all these things where it's like really, really cultural Marxist texts or postmodernist texts. It's really messed up. But let me just switch back to me. So to summarize, the concept of whiteness is a tool that's being used by the left, and it's a tool that's being used in order to achieve an end. And that end is simply to marginalize white people, to basically guilt them so much that they are going to be willing to abdicate any societal desires that they might have, that they will be willing to abdicate capitalism. They will be willing to abdicate system of law, system of government. And they will be able to use this concept of whiteness to really force white people to give up even their countries entirely. You know, this is why one of the things that they celebrate is the concept of white society is no longer being white. That they really embrace that. Oh, you know, by the year 2020 or 2040 or whatever, it's always some year in the future, US will no longer be majority white. And they celebrate that as if it's a great thing. And that's really the goal of this. Use whiteness to make the indigenous people or the people of that nation, and I say indigenous because white people are the indigenous people of America. Not necessarily the land, but the concept of America. And they are the ones that created that society. It's based on a whole bunch of white people from Europe who created these ideas of, freedom of speech, freedom of like assembly, freedom of all these things. And it's a white-based, based on European values, society. And they want it so that they will be guilted into giving that up so that other people can basically take it over. It is a slow revolution that will ultimately end in the removal of the people and their culture. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's been a long video, but I hope you watched all the way to the end. If you did, kudos on you. Good job for listening this long. I hope the volume was good. Please leave a comment in below. And thanks for watching. Bye for now.